So without further ado, we're going to move on to our keynote speaker today, Bob Inglis. Bob represented South Carolina's 4th District from 1993 to 1999, then again from 2005 to 2011. While in Congress, he was a ranking member on the Subcommittee on Energy and the Environment, and also served on the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Earlier this year, Bob used his expertise to launch the Energy and Enterprise Initiative, dedicated to using free enterprise to unleash the fuels of the future. Bob's a Duke alum, and he's taught classes here. He's an outstanding person with some really fascinating ideas, and we're absolutely thrilled that he's been a part of this conference from the very beginning of the planning process. So without further ado, Bob Inglis.
So I think if I move around a little bit and sing a few bars as that pizza settles in, I can keep you awake. If I commence singing, I will cause you to run for the exits, and that will cause everybody to wake up for sure. So I'll promise not to sing. But I am very grateful for the opportunity to be here. Very exciting to be part of this from last semester when David first mentioned it to me as an idea, and I immediately said, what a fabulous idea to hear from conservatives about a vision for environmental protection or energy futures, that sort of thing. So very exciting to be here, and I'm grateful for your interest. As might be expected, it took one of my students to ask what I think has been the best question of the day. Jessilee came up with that question herself, that last question, which was, if conservatives have as such an essential principle, conservation, protection of resources, why then aren't we hearing from conservatives on the topic of energy and climate? For example, I've expanded her question a little bit. Well, I think there are many reasons for that. But one of them that occurs to me here today is because we don't think we have an answer. And if you don't think you have an answer, you just want to change the conversation, change the topic. So, for example, if David Roche wants to talk to me about running, and he has, and we have, me much slower than David. But if he wants to talk about not the 2-mile run that we went on, because he was nice to ask me in advance, how far do you go? And so I said, well, a couple miles. And he said, okay, we can do that. And of course, he wasn't even breaking a sweat after 2 miles. But if David said to me, how about a marathon, Inglis? Let's train for the Boston Marathon. Well, I don't know about you, but I've been at some finish lines for marathons. My sister was a marathon runner, and I used to go to the finish lines, and I will tell you, I got cured of any desire to do that thing watching people come across the finish line. Some of them looked like they were near death, bleeding, vomiting, various states of just dishevelment. And so I thought, there is no reason for a human being to want to run that far, right? So, if David talks to me about running a marathon, and I don't want to do it because I don't think I can do it, then I will change the subject because I don't think I can compete with him. I'm here to suggest to you that the reason that conservatives aren't talking is we don't think we can compete. We think that this is territory staked out by the left. They've got an answer, we don't. But so mostly what I'm doing these days in my day job is trying to convince conservatives that that's not correct. That actually we have the answer that the country and the world are waiting for, which is a muscular, free enterprise answer to the energy and climate challenge that goes beyond the sentiment of the left, that can only offer sentiment on this issue, but not a real solution. Because I once heard a definition of sustainability that I now take as the operational one for the Energy and Enterprise Initiative. And it's one that I learned from a guy named Carlos Gutierrez in Spartanburg, South Carolina. He's a recycler of PET. That's the stuff that you make water bottles out of. Carlos is a Georgia Tech engineer, worked for Milliken & Company, and like many there, was spawned into free enterprise himself. And so he decided to go to Japan and check out rice sorting machines. And they're rice sorting machines that have the rice fall over a computer reader that decides whether it's a good piece of rice or a bad piece of rice. And then it hits with an air jet the dark or discolored pieces of rice and kicks them out of the stream so that only the perfect white rice is falling into the bin. Carlos decided you could do that with PET. You could crush the PET, not melt it, crush the PET, grind it up, and then sort it, and then send it back to Coca-Cola not melted, so that they melt it in their process, just like the virgin PET that they're getting that they have to melt. The virgin PET manufacturers thought there's no way that Carlos could do this and that he could never beat them on price because they assumed that he was going to melt their PET and that energy input was going to cause him to be not competitive with their virgin PET. But the exciting thing is that Carlos beats them on price. He can sell recycled PET at a lower price point than virgin PET. And so he told me the definition of sustainability that I accept. He says sustainability means making a profit. If you can make a profit, it's sustainable. If you can't, it is not. I accept that as a definition of sustainability. As a conservative and a guy who believes in free enterprise, that works for me. Because the problem, as we heard from some of the panelists earlier, is the problem of the altruism of the left is we're not sure how long it's going to last. It lasts as long as there's a sugar daddy, somebody funding the altruism, right? But once that sugar runs out, you got no more altruism. So what we're looking for is something that's sustainable, something where you can actually deliver a muscular free enterprise solution. Now, let me illustrate also my great belief in the speed with which this can happen. And I'm going to embarrass myself in the process. I was a member of Congress, as David just said, for 6 years, and I was out 6 years, and I came back for another 6. I thought I was going to continue on, but I got specifically uninvited to the Tea Party. Perhaps you will understand why, after I keep talking here, why I got uninvited. But in the first stint in Congress, I remember being in the Charlotte airport. Back then, you couldn't fly direct from Greenville, Spartanburg, South Carolina to Washington on a regional jet. You had to change planes in Charlotte. And so I remember being there in Charlotte, and this guy comes up to me and he says, "What's your email address?" This was about 1997. And I was so proud because we just had some new cards printed up, and so I handed it to him. I said, right there. He says, "That's a website." And I said, honest to goodness, "What's the difference?" Now, I don't think I'm stupid. I mean, I graduated from here in the previous century. My wife graduated from here in the previous century. I thought I was reasonably intelligent. Went to law school, did all right there. Practiced law, commercial real estate lawyer, did all right in those things. Ran for Congress, got elected. But I didn't know the difference between email address and a website. But that was 1997. And if you read Tom Friedman's book, The World is Flat, he says it's sort of 99, 2000, 2001 when it happened. So I wasn't that far off the curve. Now I can assure you, I know the difference between a website and an email address, right? The point I'm making is that technology moved very quickly. Now, there's a reference earlier today to basic research, and part of that is, I think, a difference between some libertarians and conservative Republicans like me. I see a role for the government in basic research, and that internet website confusion is an illustration of that. That has to do with DARPA and the federal government spending a lot of money for defense purposes to create an internet. And then there was this commercialization that occurred because some people with names like Gates and Jobs were making a lot of money creating technologies that the rest of us would use, right? Drove it faster than we could ever have imagined. Who would have thought back then that technology would move so fast that now I would clearly know, and everybody knows the difference between a website and an email address. But in 1997, I didn't. So I acknowledge that there are some challenges in technology, especially when it comes to electrical generation. Those are big, long-term investments. But it could be like the transformation that's occurred in information delivery is what I'm suggesting to you about expect speed if you've got muscular free enterprise. If, on the other hand, you're trying to do this in altruism or maybe getting people, altruistic people together to get the government to mandate something, or maybe incentivize it or subsidize it, then perhaps I would be, rather than having that little phone down there that does all kinds of things, I'd be driving around with a trailer behind my car and a couple of technicians back there in a government operation to try to get me connections with, say, my wife. That's what we would have, I would submit to you, if the government were doing communications. But because some people had a profit motive, and they were completely in sync with my friend Carlos Gutierrez in Spartanburg, South Carolina, saying sustainability means making a profit, we wouldn't have had that pace of change. Now, it is awkward for me to say that here because I'm having the dickens of a time getting signal on my Verizon wireless. I don't know what's wrong with this thing. Durham, North Carolina has a problem with Verizon. Does anybody know what it is? I mean, my brother-in-law's house here doesn't have Verizon connection. I got to go out in his driveway. The hotel here, anyway, anybody from Verizon? I'm complaining, all right? But consider this. It's sort of funny that I'm saying this today because just yesterday, a very liberal friend of mine, I was talking to him on the phone on the way here, he had some crack about cell phones and how it should be that the government should set up a nationwide cell phone system. And I'm thinking, I didn't challenge him on this because, you know, we disagree on so many things, but I'm thinking, that is one that is a surefire non-starter. Can you imagine if the government had tried to do cell phones and what kind of slow pace we'd be about? But because free enterprise did it, we got great phones with the occasional exception of my brother-in-law's house in Durham and a few other places. Verizon, I'm sure, is working on it because otherwise Sprint's going to eat their lunch, right? So I'm here to suggest to you that conservatives really do have the answer, but the reason we shrink in things like science denialism because we don't think we do. We're not confident of our abilities to compete with David Roche in a marathon. We're not confident of our abilities to deliver a better product. And so therefore, we shrink. But I'm here to suggest if you're a conservative, step forward and engage because we got the answer. The answer is free enterprise. And it's just really several concepts that I'd like to share with you that are, I hope, fairly specific. First of all, accountability. All conservatives of whatever slice or style agree that accountability is a key concept. If you're a libertarian like my friend Eli Lehrer, accountability is a fundamental concept of what you believe. If you're an economic issue conservative, like I am, then you understand that markets are very powerful and you want them to work very well, and it starts with accountability. If you're a social issue conservative like me, you understand that accountability is the underpinning of how we view all of human society. We believe that humans are responsible moral actors, and it underlines all of our thinking. It's why, for example, if you're a law student here, we have criminal law and a scienter requirement in any criminal act. We believe that human beings are responsible moral actors and should be held accountable for their actions. And if you're the last dock of conservatism here on the waterfront of conservatism, which would be a national security issue conservative, say a neocon, you clearly believe in accountability and you understand the power and the necessity of holding people accountable, for example, rogue nations or state-sponsored terrorism. You understand the importance of accountability. So the first point I'm making for all conservatives, whatever style of conservatism you are, whether it's a libertarian, an economic issue conservative, a social issue conservative, or a national security conservative, accountability is one of our key concepts. So, a second point that I'd make to you is that we conservatives are saying now that the reason the economy isn't taking off is the uncertainty within the system. The economic system is uncertain. That uncertainty, we say, is caused by the uncertainty of healthcare cost and regulatory cost. We say that people aren't investing because they don't know what their labor cost will be. They don't know the regulatory environment they'll face. They don't know the healthcare costs they will face. As a result, they aren't investing. Well, I would submit when it comes to energy, the reason that power companies aren't investing is they're looking for certainty in those areas and in another one, which is they've got to have certainty about carbon pricing. And many in the power sector believe that a price on carbon is inevitable, but they just don't know how much it's going to be. And so if you're the guy or the lady running a power company, you don't know what to invest in. It all depends on the carbon price. And I've had many power executives tell me, just give me certainty. If I knew what price Congress was going to put on carbon, because, as I say, many of them believe that is inevitable, then they would know whether to build the nuclear power plant or just a natural gas plant, or somehow eke out an existence with coal, or perhaps, if the signal is strong enough and the locale suits it, they'd move on to other things like wind and solar. But it all depends on the certainty of that pricing. So, first point is conservatives of all sorts believe in accountability. The second point is that we say the economy is held back right now because of the lack of certainty. And I'm submitting that in the energy sector, that lack of certainty about a carbon price holds back investment. That investment would unleash thousands of jobs because the energy sector is enormously, those projects are of mammoth proportions, and they literally employ thousands of people. Third point that conservatives, this is why conservatives must come forward with the answer, is that we are the people who talk about tax reform. We're the people who understand that you've got to set incentives right so that you don't disincentivize work. Well, right now, we tax income, but we don't tax emissions. And so, as my friend Art Laffer says, what conservative wouldn't jump at the chance to take the tax off of something you want more of, which is income, and shift the tax onto something you want less of, which is emissions? Actually, what Art says is what you arguably want less of. Because he says he's agnostic as to climate change. He doesn't know whether it's real or not. I'm a believer, he's agnostic. But you know what? Both of us come to the same place. Because it doesn't matter, says Art Laffer, whether it's real or not. He says all you need to know is you're taxing something you want more of, income, and you're not taxing something you want, or you arguably want less of, which is emissions. So he says, and I'm here to say to you, as a conservative, if you're a conservative here, why don't we change what we tax? Why don't we reduce taxes on some form of income? Maybe it's a corporate income tax. Maybe it's payroll taxes if you're worried about regressivity. Maybe it's individual income tax rates. That's Art Laffer's choice, as you might imagine, the guy that designed Ronald Reagan's tax cuts. Or some other form of taxes. What if we reduce those in an equal amount, dollar for dollar, no increase in the size of government, shifted the tax to CO2? Now, of course, many would point out, well, the problem there is people like Chuck, who understand in the state legislature, you got to have a stable source of revenue, right? That's an unstable source of revenue. Because if you start taxing carbon, you know what's going to happen? There's going to be substitution of technology, and people are going to move away from high carbon emitting pursuits and go into more efficient pursuits. So here's what you got to do. You got to, first of all, celebrate that substitution, right? Because that's, in fact, a very positive thing, because first, it creates wealth in that new technology. And second, if you care about the air, it actually cleans up the air. But even if you don't care about the air, just care about that first thing, which is the wealth creation that comes from that technology substitution. Which, of course, would probably indicate that what you want to do as part of this certainty thing in tax reform is probably have an increasing tax on carbon dioxide that reflects the fact that you're going to have a declining revenue otherwise because of that substitution. But again, we should be celebrating that technological change, right? So on this tax reform, this is where I'm submitting to conservatives. If you're a conservative here, you can go forward and engage and say, we've got the answer. It's consistent with our other answers. We want to change what we tax. We want to free up income from taxation. We want to make it so people have an incentive to work. And we want to tax something we want less of. It's an old concept, been around, Pigovian tax. It's been around a long time. And it's our idea that we can advocate in the public sphere. Now, important point that came up this morning in the first panel that is something that conservatives should hear is, what if the United States does this to ourselves and not brings anybody else along? That would be problematic, right? This is one of the many reasons that I voted against cap and trade when I was in Congress. I think cap and trade is a particularly bad idea. It's a massive tax increase, hopelessly complicated. The free allocations are embarrassing, and it decimates American manufacturing. And I think I'm using the word right. To decimate means 1 out of 10, right? And so it wouldn't destroy American manufacturing, but it would really give us a whack. And we heard that on the first panel. So it's very important, if you're a conservative, to find some way around that problem. And so I would suggest to you, as a conservative here today, that there is a way around the problem. And it's to make it a border-adjustable tax that's removed on export and imposed on import. I believe in a WTO-compliant way. And if you do this, then what you do is you basically cause China and India and other developing nations to see the need to have an equivalent system in their own countries so that they wouldn't have to pay that landing fee upon import into the United States. And while we've got it, it uses the strength of the American market, which everyone wants access to make this a free and fair trade option that has a level playing field. So that if you, again, it's sort of like the export of a BMW. You know, BMW makes some fine automobiles in Spartanburg, South Carolina. BMW means Bubba makes wheels. I don't know if you knew that, but that's what that thing means. And so they've got $5.5 billion on the ground in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And they make X5s and X6s, and all the Z4s in the world were made there. All the Z3s in the world were made there. So in that border adjustable tax, it's just like if you take one of those cars, say an X5 from Spartanburg, and you import it to France, you pay the VAT on the way in. if you're exporting a Renault from France to here, I don't know why you'd want to do that, but anyway, if you were, I'm sorry, you might have a Renault, but if you wanted one, on its way out, the VAT would come off as it comes out of France. But our X5 going into France would be hit with a VAT, right? So I'm throwing this out to law students who may be looking at becoming trade lawyers, is to see if you agree with me that this can be made WTO compliant. That's why I'm going into some detail there about how the VAT works and why this is similar to a VAT. I said earlier that I voted against cap and trade. I actually proposed an alternative when I was in Congress. It is this border adjustable tax I was just describing, and we think that we made it even more attractive for WTO compliance by making it so the inputs, energy inputs for the calculation of the landing fee or the carbon tax on the way in is based on American equivalent energy inputs, not, for example, on Chinese energy inputs. Two reasons. One, it was very difficult, obviously, to audit Chinese energy usage. Second, it makes it more clear that we're not trying to be trade punitive, because we're actually giving the Chinese good a break, because the American energy inputs would be less per unit than the Chinese inputs, because our industries are more efficient. So it's clear that we were not trying to be trade punitive. We're actually doing something quite different. We were just setting up a system that that really supplies, if you're a conservative here, I believe the answer to the first panel's challenge, which was, how do you do this without hurting the American economy? Well, the answer, I would submit for your consideration, is a border adjustable tax, removed on export, imposed on import. And then there's this question, the fourth point I'd make here, that to equip conservatives to go out there and engage and decide to challenge David Roche to this marathon. Not me, maybe you, but, and believe me, he's fast, so you're gonna have to run fast if you wanna do it. But the fourth point that I try to equip you with, if you're a conservative and you want an answer to this, is that we conservatives believe in correcting market distortions. And whatever kind of conservative you are, really, if you're a libertarian or an economic issue conservative, this is especially in your wheelhouse, it is a real bother when a market is inefficient. Because those two slices of conservatism really believe in the power of markets. And so if there's a market distortion, it should drive us nuts. And we heard this very well from earlier panels. There are several market distortions that are worth noting. One is the clumsy government regulations. Another, fickle tax incentives. Another, direct cash subsidies. And a fourth, unrecognized negative externalities. As you heard earlier, that's Econ 101. It's something that we all, actually at Duke, for those of you that went with Jeremy down the street there to that faded out blue color, it's actually Econ 51. Is it still Econ 51 at Duke? I don't know why we call it. You know, it's everywhere else is 101. Here we call it 51, just to confuse people, Jeremy, just to throw you off. But that Econ 51 concept is you want to attach negative externalities. You want to internalize those negative externalities, and that in order to overcome that market distortion. So here's a very specific proposal for you about how to deal with that. And they were well discussed in earlier panels. Let's just collapse all those market distortions into two specific policy proposals, and this is what I would hope to charge up conservatives and send you out with to preach this. Let's do two things. Let's eliminate all subsidies for all fuels. And as you heard earlier, and I was very excited to hear from really all the panelists, that makes sense. All subsidies for all fuels. And yes, there are subsidies for fossil fuels. And let's eliminate them. And then second, and this is the thing that so far, we don't have a lot of people singing with us, but let me ask you if it's a tune that really does fit with conservatism, is let's attach all cost to all fuels. Let's make all fuels fully accountable for all of their costs. So coal-fired electricity. You cause 23,600 premature deaths each year in the United States by the small particulates, the soot that come out of your stacks. Clean it up. You cause 3 million lost work days because of the same soot. Get it out of there. Oh, it's a problem for you? You don't want, the cost is too high, you tell us. Oh, I see. It's not a cost for you, but it is a cost for society. This is the tragedy of the commons we were hearing about earlier, right? 23,600 premature deaths, 3 million lost work days that coal-fired electricity is not accountable for. I started out by saying accountability is a key concept of conservatism. And so what we want to say is we're conservatives is no coal, really. Be accountable. Hold your stuff on your property. This is American common law before we had regulatory regime. This is American common law. Before that, it was British common law. Before that, it was biblical law. That I can't do on my property something that harms your property. So coal, hold your ash on your property. Now, of course, coal runs to the Congress and says, no, you can't do that. For gosh sakes, it'll drive up the cost of electricity. Well, unless you believe in the tooth fairy and that there's such a thing as a free lunch, do you think we're not already paying all of that cost? Oh no, we're paying all the cost all right. If 23,600 people die prematurely each year because of that soot, we're paying for it. Some of them are covered by the same insurance company that you're covered by. You're paying in your premium. Some of them are covered by Medicare. You're paying in Medicare taxes. Some of them are covered by Medicaid. You're paying for those learning impaired patients who go to the hospital because of those small particulates. And if they're not covered by any of the above, you're paying in something called cost shift at the hospital that causes your premiums to go up. That, from Econ 51, is something we call a free rider problem. So we fix that by saying, no, pay to ride the bus. Pay the full freight, and then we can have rates down for everybody. But if you let some free riders on board, then rates go up for others, and it causes other people to want free rides, and then the rates go up and up. So our challenge as conservatives here, I believe, is to realize that we got the answer. The strength of our ideas is exactly what the nation and the world are waiting to hear. All we've got to do is step forward and engage and deliver our deliverable in the political process. The reason we're not doing that, in part because of Jess Lee's question, is we don't think we've got an answer. The other problem we've got is that politics is infected right now in my party, I would say to you, by something called populist rejectionism, or I call it populist rejectionism. I realize, as a political science major here at Duke, I think rejectionism mostly is a foreign policy term that refers to the rejection of the state of Israel. But I'm here to submit that it's something like that when it comes to environmental thought or anything relating to the environment, or in the populist times we're in, anybody that steps forward with a solution rather than a scapegoat is at danger in the political system. I can testify to this. It's better to offer up a scapegoat rather than a solution, because solutions take at least this much time to explain. Scapegoats work better because it basically says you can say, it's all Barack Obama's fault. The structural deficit is his fault. He did it. He's been in office 4 years. The structural deficit's been coming for decades, but it's all his fault. And when the guy comes up at your town hall meeting and says, keep your government hands off my Medicare, and you start explaining to him that that is a government program, then you're reaching for solutions, not scapegoats. So I realize that we're in a time right now where populist rejectionism is reigning in my party. But I would submit to you, if you're of my party, that unless we can tell students at Duke University and colleges and universities around the rest of the country that we've got an answer to this energy and climate challenge, we're going to lose them like we're in the process of losing Hispanics and like we lost black folks when we told them we didn't like them very much. And we will become a minority party that never again delivers these solutions. And the country and the world will be hampered by having people of good intentions but no idea how to deliver a solution. So like, I got a sister-in-law. She's a sweet Democrat. She wants everybody to have a house. Well, how are we going to get that house? Some Republican home builder got to go dig some footers, put in some concrete and some rebar, and by golly, build a house. Then we can have a house. Sentiment won't get you that house. But if my party, the one that digs the footers and builds the house, and can come up with a by golly solution on energy and climate, says to young people that hit the doors at lunch, we really don't have an answer, then they go to the other party because they figure this is a challenge of my time, and if you don't have an answer, I'll go to somebody else's shop. And so for those that remain that are conservative with me, please understand our challenge is to sell a message that works and to make sure that we have a product that works. Because politics, just like business, you gotta deliver value. And you get away for a while with selling scapegoats and selling fear, but eventually people figure you out. And when they do, they turn away from your product and they go to the competitor. So our challenge right now is to win them back by saying, we got an answer. Let me see if you've got any questions, see if I can answer them. I don't know if I have any time left. Maybe, do we have time left for questions?
So we're going to do questions like we did before. We have a bunch of great ones here for Bob, so we're going to ask them and then let Bob respond, and feel free to, answer them as you see fit. We're going to start with one that we got early in your speech from John Nash Marovich at the Nicholas School. How within the conservative movement does one rectify the seeming anti-intellectualism of some members who seem to deny science? I've heard a great many elite smart people speak today, but that is often an attack leveled on people in the environmental movement. So yes, the anti-intellectualism issue.
Yes. Another good question from one of my students last semester. So see, I got two great questions, one from Jesse Lee, one from John. I planted them both. No, actually, I didn't. John, yes, I would say that we do have this, that goes to the politics argument I was just making. Mostly, I hope you heard a policy argument here, but if you're a conservative, I was also there at the end making a politics argument, an argument about our political future. If I could answer in that political vein again, if we are seen as the anti-intellectual party, essentially the know-nothings of this current age, it'll last for a while. It'll last as long as the pain of the Great Recession is hurting right here. But if that pain goes away and we're no longer able to sell scapegoats and fear, we're toast. And so you have to engage. You have to celebrate the fact that here at Duke University there are really bright people who know things. Rather than saying we don't want to hear them, let's say, no, we really want to hear you. Now, if their political philosophy gets into, regulating this and subsidizing that and, those kind of solutions, and we say to them, no, that's not going to work. What we're looking for is something sustainable. But if I could expand that question just a little bit, part of it too is since I can't do the Latin, but help me out. Somebody, Etrudio and Religio. Is that how you say it? I don't know how you say it. Anyway, our motto here at Duke is education and religion, the challenge on I identified myself earlier as a socialist conservative, economic issue conservative as well. Many people in the district that I've represented believe that somehow this science and all the great science that goes on here at Duke University is somehow an affront to the sovereignty of God. And that when you particularly talk about climate change, you're talking about entering in the province of saying that God won't determine the longevity of the earth, rather we in our human action will, and it's immediately rejected because by definition it can't be so. And I understand that, and I understand the history of our sort of distrust of science in the communities of faith. But I would encourage particularly young believers of faith to engage this way and say, you know what? We really believe that God wants us to discover the intricacies of his glorious creation. He doesn't want to hide those from us. In fact, this creator God is also a teacher God who wants to show it to us. And he's very excited about it. In fact, he does the sunset every day. Do it again. Do it again. Just to enjoy it. So shouldn't we as believers be people who say, it's fabulous. We're going to go figure out how this climate system works as much as we can. And then act in stewardship in that system, not confronting the sovereignty of God, but rather working with that wonderful creator, teacher, to make the garden even more beautiful. That's a positive message rather than one that says, no, listen, we are bound to polluting and destroying this earth, and it's going to get ugly in the garden. Well, I can tell you that won't sell too well among the colleges and universities that I visit with the Energy and Enterprise Initiative. It may work with some folks that feel like their time is nearly done here on this earth, and they're just consigned to that, but their children and grandchildren don't believe that. Thank goodness they don't believe it. Thank goodness they're saying, come on, let's do it. Let's clean it up. Give me an amen. I'll stop preaching on that. Next question.
And this is from Peter, and it's generally about the path forward at this point. So politically, we face so many obstacles. With the current election coming up and all these issues recognized, what is a way that you could see, what vision would you foresee for like a timeline for getting these free enterprise solutions in place?
Yes, great question. Okay, so scenario number one, my choice, Mitt Romney wins the election. If so, here's what happens. He is Nixon goes to China. By the way, is the president's portrait back up in the law school nowadays? When I was here, there's a big controversy about his portrait over there. Is it back up? Jonathan, is it back up over there? No? Anyway, it's back up? Okay, good. It's back up. It's big. Nixon goes to China, right? He's the only one that could go to China. He ran against the Pinko communist, and therefore he could go visit. Bill Clinton was the only one that could sign welfare reform. If you're a progressive here today and you're worried about climate change, please, if Mitt Romney gets elected, say, okay, there's one thing that you can be excited about, which is the guy who is a champion of free enterprise, who understands that definition of sustainability I gave you a while ago, can actually be the guy that leads on energy and climate. Now, he does have to get through this populist rejectionist period, but I would submit to you that's going away. It's going away as soon as the Great Recession ends. The problem is how long the Great Recession takes, because the Great Recession is about deleveraging at this point, and that is a very painful process. But it will end. And when it ends, I would submit to you that Mitt Romney can be Nixon goes to China, Bill Clinton signs welfare reform, Mitt Romney signs something like a grand bargain involving a tax swap. In part, the tax reform could involve this tax swap that I was describing. Now, if scenario number two evolves, and that is that Barack Obama is reelected, then I would say to you that if you're in the Obama administration, please tell them not to try to redeem or resurrect cap and trade. That dog is dead. It has been branded as cap and tax, and it will not live again. And get them, particularly talk to Secretary Chu, who was for a carbon tax before he was for cap and trade, and get him to return to himself. And to go down to the White House and say to the president, sir, you got to do something very different if you're going to solve this problem. And you got to reach out to conservatives. I understand that he reached the idea of the progressives. Progressives here are probably saying, you're seething at me now. You're saying, no, that's why we did cap and trade, because we were trying to get you, Inglis. And you did acid rain with George H.W. Bush, or it was before my time. But we were trying to pattern it after that. And then you told us you didn't like the girl that we brought to you. Well, it's because you got it so complicated, and you gave those free allocations. And it decimates American manufacturing. It's way more point sources than the acid rain thing. And so now, in scenario number 2, Barack Obama wins. Come to the country with a completely different approach. And may I humbly suggest it's something like a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Off income, on carbon, border adjustable tax, part of a grand bargain. And I think it happens, and further answer question 15 and 16.
And we'll finish up with one general line of questioning, and it's, a lot of these questions that we got refer to the general current Republican antipathy for any tax of any type. Yeah. Even if, so in the face of that, in the face of, Grover Norquist and those sorts of ideas, how can the Republican Party not just rebrand itself, but just get any tax done?
Yeah. Well, the good news is, as Ezra Klein reported recently in the Washington Post, Grover Norquist has been clear that if you're talking about a carbon tax that is in dollar for dollar substitution of another tax that you're reducing or eliminating, then it is not violative of his taxpayer protection pledge, which is very exciting to me at the Energy and Enterprise Initiative, because that gives us some breathing room. We can say, listen, this is, to conservatives, this is revenue neutral. We're not doing cap and tax. We're not growing the government. And so, in other words, there are ways to do it if it is, in fact, revenue neutral. But it is very important to conservatives to not grow the government. This is something that we got to agree, is just a fundamental difference between progressives and conservatives. We don't want to grow the government. If you're a progressive and you think the government should be larger and even more helpful, well, then we just have a disagreement. And it'll be settled at ballot boxes about who gets to implement that choice. But I would also, I'm speaking, it sounds like I'm speaking just in this binary world of conservatives and progressives, but I got to acknowledge here that many progressives agree with what I've just described here as a solution, as a conservative solution. In fact, at some danger to my own standing with my party, I will tell you that it's an idea that Al Gore has had for about 20, 25 years. The thing that inspired me to file that bill that I mentioned earlier is that I knew that Art Laffer, who lives in Nashville, Tennessee, had been over to see his neighbor, Al Gore, and they had talked about this bill, or this concept, again, a concept that Al Gore has been advocating for 20, 25 years. And Art Laffer said, that works for me. And I figured, if Art Laffer and Al Gore can agree on a policy prescription, then we can bring America together on this thing. So I was a little bit naive, perhaps, as the Great Recession came on, to be trying to sell that kind of message as my dominant message. But I believe after the Great Recession is over, we will get to that. And if I could close with this is why I think we'll get to that. I had the opportunity to be in Iraq 5 times, in Afghanistan 4 times. It's different than serving there. There are a lot of wonderful people who serve there. I was a visitor there, visiting the most amazing people in the world. Not the Afghans and the Iraqis, they're fine, but the Americans serving there. And in all those visits, I never asked a single one of those servicemen and women whether they were Republican or Democrat. And it never came up. Because when you're in a war zone, you're just an American. You're not a Republican, you're not a Democrat. It seems to me that that's the least that those men and women serving in places right now like Afghanistan could expect of the U.S. Congress, is could you go there and serve without asking the question whether you're Republican or Democrat? And just figure out whether there really is a way to bring together Art Laffer and Al Gore and find an American solution that goes forward rather than selling me a scapegoat about why the other tribe must be beheaded. But rather tell me this is a way forward and it works. And the great encouragement I give you about the innovation, and I realize I am counting on innovation. I admit to that. I joined Jeremy Curl in saying that I'm an optimist about that innovation, though, because of this. In that first visit to Iraq, we went to Fallujah. So Jim Dement, Sound Brownback, Rob Portman, and I were on this trip. And we went to Fallujah, saw the Battle of Fallujah and slides as they explained how they did it. And this wonderful American general named Marine Corps General Sattler showed us many slides, but he showed us his favorite slide, which, because of some excellent staff work by my team, is now hanging in my little office at my house in Travelers Rest, South Carolina. And it's a picture of two Americans in uniform. One of them has his helmet off, that's against regulations, has his helmet off, and he's lifting it on a stick above a concrete wall that he and his buddy are crouched behind. The buddy is on his stomach, has his gun trained through a hole in the bottom of the concrete wall. So what's happening here is, as the one figured out that they're shooting at this American helmet, he says, against regulation, but let's do a decoy. He puts it on the stick. He lifts it above the concrete wall. They start shooting at it. They identify their position. The other guy takes them out. So there's a stack of sticks up against the concrete wall. And General Sattler takes his laser pointer and he puts it on and he says, I can assure you, members of Congress, it's a sophisticated but affordable weapon system, the stack of sticks. Then he said something very serious. He said, that's the kind of creativity you get from people who grew up in freedom. They innovate, and they change rapidly, and they do things that nobody ever thought they could do, like even to teach a Republican congressman from South Carolina the difference between an email and a website. Thank you very much.
Bob, that was incredible. Thank you so much for providing the keynote today. We're going to hop right into our next panel, and I just want to remind everyone that coming up and down the aisle are our ushers with question sheets and questions like fuel the event. You guys have been great throughout. And our next panel is North Carolina's energy future, and I'm going to introduce Jessa Lee Lanfried to get started off. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bob. This panel is about our home state of North Carolina. Our first speaker is John Hood. John Hood is president and chairman of the John Locke Foundation, a North Carolina think tank that publishes Carolina Journal, a monthly newspaper with a readership of nearly 200,000 North Carolinians. In addition to his duties at the John Locke Foundation, Mr. Hood is a syndicated columnist for the Winston-Salem Journal, High Point Enterprise, Gaston Gazette, Durham Herald-Sun, and newspapers in 50 other North Carolina communities. He also writes a monthly column, Free and Clear, for Business North Carolina magazine. Welcome, John Hood.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I've appreciated the opportunity to be here much of the day as I watch the different speakers present and exchange ideas. And I will have to say, at least until my talk, for the most part, agree on most things. Now, one thing I would observe about the conservative movement, particularly the modern post-war conservative movement, though I suppose this would also be true for the classical liberals of the 19th century or the Tories of the 19th century, is it's a movement that is very comfortable with difference. Different ideas, different points of view, different interpretations of the facts, different proposals about how to get to a common destination. And it is a movement that is predicated on the idea that intentions are all well and good, but what really counts are the results. So having the same destination doesn't tell us which road to take. Sometimes roads that look like they might be the best roads to take turn out to be the wrong ones. In fact, and this isn't just sometimes, this is often, when it comes to government, I might venture to say it is most of the time. That the road that looks like it's the right destination at the time turns out to be the wrong road to take, largely because we think we know what we do not fully know. This reminds me of the Robert Frost poem about the road that is less traveled by. You know, of course, that was a joke. He was ridiculing a friend of his who was indecisive. So people all throughout the course of time after Robert Frost wrote this famous poem believed that Robert Frost was actually saying that if given two roads, you ought to take the one that is less traveled by because that would make all the difference. That was intended to be satirical. In fact, get on a road. That was his real point to his friend, but people misunderstood the poem. In a way, though, I like Robert Frost's unintentional but very popular message. Don't just jump on the road. Wait a minute. Hold on a second. Think of this through. And I think when it comes to energy policy, to climate change policy, to regulatory policy, there's absolutely nothing wrong with asking for careful study and interpretation and as much data as possible and making sure you don't precipitously jump on a road that is not going to arrive at your destination. So, with that being said, what I would observe is that because we are many of us are conservatives who are comfortable with different points of view, and even though we are all about results rather than intentions, it's also important not to question each other's intentions or each other's commitment to truth and to knowledge. So I would observe, for example, that many of the ideas that have been proposed to address the probably real issue of climate change are themselves poorly informed by science, that is, economic science. Climate science is part of the story, and economic science is part of the story. Economic science tells us that we have to carefully weigh the costs and benefits of taking any government action because the benefits may be obvious to us at the beginning. We may think we understand the costs. We may understate the costs. We tend to understate costs. And as a result, we don't get ideal outcomes. And I'll give you some examples from North Carolina so we can be specific to our own state, our own debate. So in 2003, there was a bill passed through the General Assembly of North Carolina, signed by the governor, called the Clean Smokestacks Bill. This Clean Smokestacks was supposed to address the issue that Congressman Inglis brought up of particulate matter and other emissions coming out of the smokestacks of North Carolina's coal-fired power plants, of which there are 14. There was, in fact, absolutely no work done on the cost-benefits of this proposal. There was never any effort to quantify whether doing this plan would have any significant health benefits or any significant effect on the CO2 emissions and therefore on the climate. Of course, North Carolina by itself couldn't possibly have an effect on that, but maybe on human health in North Carolina. But there was no work done on that at all. The entire argument was, if you care about the environment, you will pass this bill. If you don't care about the environment, if you want to be in the pocket of the big business interests, you'll be against the bill. And of course, the big business interests were actually for the bill too, because it had payoffs to the power utilities and to others. They got what they wanted, and the environmentalists got what they wanted, and what we ended up with was a series of regulations, very costly regulations on coal-fired power plants that were supposed to, at the time, cost $2.3 billion over a number of years to comply with. By 2009, that number had already been adjusted to $3.2 billion. The likely number will be $4 billion or more. Now, this is a bill that was just passed in 2003. This wasn't that long ago. So what we have is a proposal that sounded good, that had a reasonable intention, and cost a great deal more than anticipated. Now, that might be worth it if the benefits were larger than the $3 billion or $4 billion. Well, what are the benefits? North Carolina's air quality was improving before the passage of Clean Smokestacks. It has continued to improve. If you are inclined to be dismissive of economic science, you might just look at 2003, draw a line after that, say, hey, the air's getting cleaner. The bill has succeeded. But if you were to use a longer time frame and you examine the full trend, you would see that North Carolina's air quality trend has not been affected at all by the enactment of clean smokestacks. So, as far as I can tell, the rough estimate of environmental benefits from clean smokestacks was $0, and the cost is probably something like $4 billion. Now, this is what happens in the real world of legislation, and we ought to keep that in mind. 2007, the legislature's not done raising energy prices, so in 2007 they do another bill, Senate Bill 3. Once again, most of the interest groups are bought off. They're for it. Power companies are for it because they get construction work in progress. Essentially, they get to build into the rate base the future nuclear plants that they, at the time, expected to build. Not so sure anymore, but at the time, that seemed to be the obvious path through the forest. Senate Bill 3 also included renewable portfolio standards, a requirement that the commercial utilities in North Carolina purchase solar, wind, biomass, bicyclists, turning windmills, I don't know. Whatever you can come up with, you're supposed to buy it at a very high cost, and that is supposed to add up to, along with efficiency gains, 12% or so of the total sales. Now, the utility companies knew very well they would never meet this goal. They figured they'd pass it, they'd get what they wanted. Some years later, they would go back and they would take the portfolio standard down a little bit or figure out a way to finagle it, which is what we're doing right now. And by the way, I'm in favor of finagling it because it's foolish and would never have been accomplished, never have been reached. But in the meantime, large numbers of businesses have gotten what amounts to a subsidy from the state because Duke Power, now the main utility company, there's a small amount in northeastern North Carolina that's not sold by Duke Energy, but basically Duke Energy is now the monopolist in North Carolina, and they are not going to be able to meet the standard. And if you're ordered as Duke Energy to purchase all these things, you're creating an artificial market for solar and wind that wouldn't exist in a non-subsidized environment. If you got rid of all the subsidies, these industries wouldn't get any significant share of the power grid, but they are because of the government regulation. That's going to cost us several thousand jobs over the course of the next few years, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $150 to $200 million of our economy sucked into a proposal that didn't make a lot of economic sense. None of which is to say that we can't be creative about solving real problems that physical science presents us, but just to observe that science also exists in the analysis of the cost and benefits of regulations or taxes or subsidies or anything else. And if we're not going to use those scientific tools, we're going to end up with North Carolina's current problem. And North Carolina's current problem is that our economy is uncompetitive and unsuccessful. We have one of the worst economies in the United States. Our unemployment rate is fourth or fifth highest, depending upon the month you look at. If you look at the underemployment rate, that's technically the U6 rate, includes people who've given up looking for work, people who are working part-time but wish they were working full-time. That number in North Carolina is in the neighborhood of 17.5%. In some counties, it's over 20%. And one of the reasons why North Carolina's economy has become uncompetitive is that we have taken on regulatory costs that our neighboring states have not. All the surrounding states have experienced very similar air quality changes. They haven't enacted any of these bills. These bills were written, one of them at least was written by Environmental Defense Fund, by the way, back in 2003. It's your fault. The other states weren't so gullible and they didn't pass them, and it didn't matter because the air quality trends have been the same. Now, what does energy have to do with the economy? Well, it's not very simple, but it's kind of simple. For a book I published earlier this year, I looked at several dozen studies of state economic growth patterns over the last 30, 40 years, looking for what variables that policymakers can affect has a significant influence on state economic growth, and what variables really don't. And here's what I found out from the academic research. Again, dozens of studies, some of them produced right here at Duke. Overall tax burden, regulatory costs, the concentration of industry in a state, and energy prices are net negative. So everything else being equal, a state that has somewhat higher cost of energy will have lower rates of economic growth. On the positives, a certain amount of spending on public safety, a certain level of quality of infrastructure, and the level of private investment are all positively correlated with state economic growth. Marginal income tax rates are very negatively correlated. They're much worse than overall taxes is the marginal income tax rate. And something else that is very negative for economies is the amount of spending on social services and Medicaid. A negative, a big negative. A big positive, average test scores of students and the rate of entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurs create most net new jobs. Mixed would be government spending on education and infrastructure. Some studies show positive, some studies show a negative, including for higher education spending, and some are a wash. That's really not a clear signal. So here's what we know. One of the things that states can't do a great deal to influence national and international decisions and flows and trends and industries and so forth. States are not a big part of that mix. We can't control the Fed. Apparently no one can control the Fed. We can't control trade policy. States have limited tools to deploy, but one of them is to avoid unnecessary increases in the cost of energy, because that will have a deleterious effect on economic growth. So as we look forward in 2013 and beyond in North Carolina, lots of talk is about production. Is it possible to generate significant energy and revenues out of onshore oil or offshore oil or onshore natural gas or offshore natural gas? That's a big issue right now in North Carolina politics. The governor's race, it's an issue. The legislature has already enacted legislation this year that sets up a process to authorize onshore hydraulic fracturing for natural gas. What I would caution my conservative friends, my Republican friends, is take seriously the science here. Don't overestimate the potential production and revenues from natural gas exploration. I'm sure that there will be some, but let's not get carried away. I've seen some of my Republican friends who argue that they can reform the North Carolina tax code, cut the marginal rates really low, because energy receipts are going to pay for state government, and I will tell them, no, don't. Look, if that happens, let's be pleasantly surprised. I fear that if you build that into the mix, you will be unpleasantly surprised. So let's be cautious about this, but I see no good reason not to explore these opportunities. But for me, the more important area is not on the production side, but on the consumption side. Are we going to lift or at least modify some of these costly rules that drive up the cost of electricity and a little bit the cost of gasoline and diesel fuel in North Carolina? Are we going to lift those things and make our economy a bit more competitive? Or are we going to continue to place intentions and sound bites above real, hard economic and scientific knowledge? Thank you much.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Representative Chuck McGrady. Chuck McGrady represents the 117th District of North Carolina at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He has an extensive background in conservation, including serving in a variety of roles at the National Sierra Club office. He served as the organization's president, vice president, and treasurer, among others, over a number of years. He's also taken a variety of leadership roles in conservation efforts here in North Carolina, including serving as the executive director of the Environmental and Conservation Organization of Henderson County. He's a lawyer by training and practiced corporate law in Atlanta before embarking on his conservationist and political career. Welcome to Representative Chuck McGrady.
Thank you for that introduction. I've been here all morning, and I feel like I'm overmatched. All of the other speakers have significant policy background and have studied the subject of energy at great length. I'm I think the only current public official among the delegation you're hearing from today, and I'd tell you first and foremost, I probably wouldn't tell you that energy was my specialty. Probably public lands or clean water. I want to acknowledge, first off, I got a little help from Will Morgan over at the Sierra Club in sort of pulling together my thoughts. Unlike most of my colleagues, or many of my colleagues, I don't have any opposition in November. I represent a wildly conservative Republican district, and having made it through a primary, I decided I was going to take some vacation. So Will was used as someone to debate some of the issues before I got here, and if I got it right, Will, you get credit, and if I screwed it up, that's my fault. Will told me, though, Chuck, you got a rather unique perspective, and I would say to him that, no, it's rather a peculiar perspective. How does one become a Republican legislator and be a former president of the Sierra Club? It's not exactly the best credential to run in a Republican primary. Actually, I think I'm probably an endangered species. I go back doing environmental work to a time very different than this. I started my first environmental work with a young congressman from Georgia, supported by the Sierra Club and the League of Conservation Voters, and was very good on a wide range of issues, and his name is Newt Gingrich. At the same time, I was working with another soon-to-be congressman, very different political ilk, but his name is John Lewis, and they worked together on acid rain in a very different time than we find ourselves in. The subject is North Carolina's energy future, and I think what you need to do first is determine what the goals that the state is going to strive for when setting energy policy. And I think the goals are fairly easy to state. One, we want reliable energy. We want affordable energy. We want energy that doesn't adversely impact public health or the environment. And many of my colleagues would argue, well, this relates to job creation, and we need an energy policy that is pro-jobs. Now, the states have certain powers in regard to setting energy policy, but there's also a lot that is out of the control. I think it's important to really understand what the state role is. Offshore drilling is controlled by the federal government. It's not going to be something, I don't think, that the state is going to be the primary player in. Oil prices are determined by the international market and by OPEC and others. The same would be true with natural gas. And so what we do here in North Carolina is not going to wildly change the price of natural gas. States, I serve on the Transportation Committee, and states have very little control over production of transportation fuels, for example. They have a lot more to do with electricity production, although electricity obviously is becoming more of a transportation tool. And states with regulated utilities, such as North Carolina, the one thing they do have a lot of control over is investor-owned utilities, or as John mentioned, that really means Duke in this state now. We've got one, who generate electricity. And so the state government controls decisions regarding its utility through its state utility commission, and they have the authority to direct energy policy through enabling legislation that the General Assembly passes. The legislature can require its utility to generate specific percentages of their overall electricity generation from certain sources, and John mentioned we did that back in 2003 or 5 when we passed the legislation related to renewable energy portfolio standards. So that comes to really, well, what's my conservative vision for energy policy in North Carolina? First, I think the goal should be the free market. I wasn't a big fan. In fact, I opposed the renewable energy portfolio standard. We've now passed it, and I'm not sure exactly what we need to do with it. Business is now relying on what we've passed, and so there's some argument that can be made that, okay, just leave it and let's not let business have some reliability based on the law that's been passed. But at the same time, I don't think it was good policy when it was passed. A lot of others have spoken to the other principles. I think it's very clear to me that fossil fuels have a lot of subsidies too. I don't know what the exact number is, but we need to get out of the subsidies business. And others have articulated much better than I could. I'm not an economist, but the negative externalities related to the cost that our energy has. Bottom line, as a conservative, I'm fully in favor of allowing the free market to dictate our energy choices. But my view right now is there's not an even playing field. And so I want to touch on just two things that are really specific to North Carolina. There are some policies, I believe, that the North Carolina General Assembly could enact to promote renewable energy generation that would actually mean removing barriers to the free market and wouldn't, I don't believe, cost the taxpayer a dime. Currently in North Carolina, we don't allow something called third-party sales. Third-party sales refer to a situation where a company, for example, a solar energy company out in Nashville, comes in and installs solar panels on the roof of a large commercial building, Kmart or Walmart or something, and then sells the electricity directly to Walmart or Kmart. Under current law, the owner of the solar panels would have to sell the produced energy to the utility company, Duke, who then sells the power back to Walmart. This sets up, this really doesn't set up a situation that allows the market to do what it could do here. I suggest to you we would have a lot more in the way of renewable energy. It's just it's an area of business out my way in the West that's just taking off. But the fact that North Carolina requires companies that are fully capable of financing, getting financing to put those solar arrays up on big commercial buildings to sell their power back to Duke before they get the power back to the company that is actually indirectly producing it is a real mistake. And North Carolina is one of only, I believe, 3 or 4 states that actually prohibit third-party sale of renewable energy. And it's getting very close to a majority of the states now have actually gone in the opposite direction, and I think we need to join them. The hot issue of the day, I guess, has been fracking, and we've had some cartoons about it. That was my life back in most of the last session. I would confess to you that I am one of 2 Republicans that did not support the fracking bill as it passed the General Assembly and did not support the override of the governor's veto. But not too much should be read into that. I was actually very close to supporting that bill. I spent a lot of time going to Pennsylvania, a lot of time talking to regulators in other states. And what I learned really frustrated me, and it speaks to a lot of the discussion, the political discussion that occurred a bit this morning. The arguments are being made about whether we ought to allow hydraulic fracturing in North Carolina were really like 2 ships passing in the night. My friends in the environmental community way overstated the problems with fracking, in my opinion. What was that movie, Gasland, was out there, and the popular image was, we're going to frack, and, you're going to have, flames shooting out of your faucet. That was silly. Actually has nothing to do with hydraulic fracturing. It might have something to do with drilling, but we actually allowed drilling here, and that wasn't the issue at all. And if you go up to Pennsylvania, there are legitimate environmental issues, costs of hydraulic fracturing, and it's not just hydraulic fracturing, it's really drilling for natural gas that some of these companies might want to externalize. And the role of government was to make sure that doesn't happen. Transportation, how much water is going to be used? What do you, when you put the chemical mix down that shaft, is it a closed loop system, or how do you clean that up? But most noteworthy is if you look at the regulatory schemes in other states that have been dealing with this a longer period of time than we were proposing, really, soil and sedimentation is one of the biggest issues. It's not a lot of these other things that have gotten all the press. And so on the one hand, you had my friends in the environmental community painting this just horrible picture of hydraulic fracturing. And on the other hand, as John sort of referred to, some of my friends in the business community, we were immediately going to solve all of our employment problems in the state, balance our budget, and a whole range of other things. And yet, wait a second. The price of natural gas is at an all-time low. We don't have nearly as much natural gas as all of these other states do. The other states have already been built out. In fact, they've got more natural gas than they know what to do with. They're almost at a point of having just to burn it off. And why would somebody come to North Carolina real quickly to solve all our employment problems and bring all these new revenues into the state? I would suggest to you that fracking and the argument over fracking is exactly what's now wrong with the debate that's going on a wide range of environmental issues as I look at them. People on different sides of the arguments seem oblivious to what the facts are. They reach decisions for whatever reason. They're against it or they're for it. And it's very disconcerting how little attention is paid to the facts. And so I would tell you that we authorized hydraulic fracturing to go forward. It's not going to start until 2014. I would tell you, for those of you who are against it, that in my opinion, with my credentials, I don't think it's nearly the bad thing that you think it's going to be. And for those who are wildly for it, I would say it's not going to be the solution to all the state's economic and job-related problems. But it is a type of issue that increasingly is problematical for me as a policymaker and very frustrating for me as an environmental leader, as I struggle to square up the facts and reach, I would hope, to a place where we get good policy. I've been a conservative for a pretty good long time, and that has been a very difficult thing to be within the environmental movement. But I would suggest, and this is a little off topic, but my suggestion would be that both the conservative movement and Republican Party specifically has really the same problem that the environmental movement has, and that is there. And Bob touched on this really, really clearly. We continue to really play to a smaller and smaller base, and the environmental issues are no longer salient political issues, and that's a problem for those of us who care about clean water and clean air and public lands. And I'm afraid that my party and those who come at these issues from a conservative slant, if they refuse to address in a very positive fashion issues like climate change, we too are destined to be not an important player in the political process. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Our final panelist on the North Carolina panel is Christopher Ayers. Chris Ayers is a North Carolina utilities and environmental attorney at Poynter Spruill. His practice focuses on the representation of electric, telecommunications, gas, water, and wastewater public utilities. He also practices in the areas of environmental, land use, renewable energy, and appellate law. He has published a number of utilities, energy, and environmental law articles and serves on the North Carolina Environmental Management Commission. He also served as a law clerk for the Honorable Linda McGee on the North Carolina Court of Appeals from 2002 to 2003. We're really excited to welcome Chris Ayers. Thank you.
Good afternoon. One other thing that I should mention is I'm a member of Duke class of 1999, so it's always good to come back up to Durham and to visit with you. The first thing I thought when Representative McGrady said that he was a lawyer is, oh no, he stole my lawyer joke, but he didn't, so I'll go ahead and tell it. I am a lawyer, and of course there are a lot of lawyer jokes out there, and one of my clients the other day, I got on the telephone with him, and he said, I've got a joke for you. I said, okay. And he said, there were these two guys, and they got in a hot air balloon one day, and they got up, and the wind got a hold of them and just swept them away, and they're going over the farms and cities and towns and all that, and finally the wind stopped blowing, and they're just hovering over a general area. No idea where they were. And so one of them said, well, I see a guy down there. Let me ask him where we are. So he yells down to the guy, and he said, can you tell me where we are? And the guy looked up, and he said, you're in a hot air balloon. And the guy in the hot air balloon looked over at his friend, and he says, that guy is a lawyer. And the other guy said, I don't understand. How do you know? He says, well, he said two things. One, what he said was absolutely true. And the second thing was it was absolutely useless. So my hope today is that I can tell you things that are absolutely true, but are absolutely useful as we engage in discussion on energy policy in North Carolina. I will mention I am a member of the North Carolina Environmental Management Commission. We are an environmental rulemaking entity here in North Carolina. I'm not here in my official capacity today. Just thought that I would mention that. But it does give me a perspective as a regulator, and much of my utilities practice is in front of the North Carolina Utilities Commission, so I'm going to try and put on the regulator hat today as I address my comments to you. So what does North Carolina's energy future look like? I think in order to answer that question, you need to have a good perspective of who the key players are in North Carolina's energy world. And from my perspective, there are two key regulatory players in North Carolina that you need to be aware of. The first is the North Carolina Utilities Commission, and the second is the North Carolina Department of Environment and Natural Resources. Now, the North Carolina Utilities Commission, as you've heard from some of our earlier speakers, they are responsible for regulating public utilities in North Carolina. That's electric, gas, water, wastewater. They're responsible for that regulatory paradigm. They're responsible for setting rates. They're responsible for ensuring safe, reliable utility service, be it electric, water, sewer, what have you. And those are services provided by public utilities. They do not regulate your municipalities. They do not regulate your electric co-ops. It is only your public utilities, which in this case would be Duke Power. And they're governed by Chapter 62 of the North Carolina General Statutes. Now, the North Carolina Department of Environment and Natural Resources, which you'll probably hear me call DENR later, so I don't have to keep repeating it, they're responsible for implementing and enforcing the environmental laws in North Carolina. That's air and water, particulate matter, all the buzzwords that you've heard today. Now, each of these agencies have a different mission and a distinct focus in terms of what they're concerned about. The Utilities Commission is concerned about reliable utility service at the lowest cost possible. And they are responsible for setting your utility rates. A lot of people don't realize that Duke can't just raise the electric price anytime they want. They have to go before the Utilities Commission. They have to basically prove that the cost of service has gone up and that their current rates are not recovering that entire cost of service, nor the reasonable rate of return that they're allowed to earn on that. And this is oversimplified, but you basically pour all that into a formula. You argue about what should or should not go into the formula, and then that's what produces your rates. And then you argue about how you divide that between industrial, commercial, and residential customers. That's what the Utilities Commission is concerned about. Diener is concerned about the protection of air and water quality. So on the one hand, you've got an agency that's concerned about cost and reliability, and you've got another agency that is concerned about environmental concerns. And both of those entities are key players in how North Carolina energy policy is going to look going forward. Now, both of these agencies, I should mention, they are limited in their authority. They are limited to the authority that the General Assembly confers upon them. And we'll talk a little about how that authority actually plays out in practice as I continue. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. There are a variety of ways to generate electricity. You've got coal, you've got gas, you've got oil, you've got renewable energy, solar, wind, you've got nuclear. So if we're talking about reliability and just making sure we've got all of our energy bases covered, why doesn't Duke Energy just run out and build a lot of nuclear plants, shut down coal, shut down gas? Nuclear has no emissions. It's got the nuclear waste problem. I won't go into that. But from an emissions standpoint, it's clean. So why doesn't Duke just run out, solve the environmental problem, and build nuclear? Well, nuclear is extremely expensive. And in order to get the best bang for your buck with nuclear, you've got to build a pretty large plant. So if Duke Energy needs 100 megawatts of electricity, they just can't run out and build a 1 gigawatt nuclear plant because you've got 900 megawatts that somebody's got to pay for, and that's paid for through electric rates, but it's sitting there unused, and it could sit there unused for years and years and years. The Utilities Commission is concerned with something that's called reasonable imprudence. They will not allow an electric company or any other utility to build facilities that are not needed. And that is an effort to protect ratepayers so that you as ratepayers who are paying for the facilities, you're paying for the electric lines, you're not paying for stuff that's not needed. So Duke can't run out and just build all nuclear to solve the emissions problem because the commission would not deem it to be reasonable and prudent. Another example. In a number of Utilities Commission proceedings lately, we have seen environmental advocacy groups appear before the commission, and they have asked for the commission to require Duke or Progress to generate more renewable energy, generate more of your electricity using renewable means, such as wind, solar, biomass. The commission is limited in terms of what they can do to Duke or Progress when it comes time for them to generate their actual electricity. For example, we had a number of groups appear at the Duke Progress merger hearing, and they were very vocal on trying to get regulatory conditions imposed that forced additional renewable energy to be generated as a condition of the merger. Again, we go to the reasonable and prudent analysis. Is solar, wind, biomass, is that the most reasonable and prudent means of generating electricity in North Carolina? At this point, while the prices of renewable energy are coming down, they're not on par with coal yet. Now, I'm not factoring in externalities, or those issues. Those can certainly become part of the debate. But looking at a pure dollars and cents analysis, coal generation is still the cheapest way to generate electricity, and you've got to have a certain amount of baseload generation. When I say baseload generation, that is when you flip on the switch, you want the light to come on. When the last person sits down on their couch at night, flips on the TV to watch Dancing with the Stars, that TV's got to come on. So there's got to be a certain level of baseload electricity that is dependable, that is also at a low cost, so that people across North Carolina can afford it. So the Commission has got to balance all of these issues when they're looking at whether or not they can require Duke to generate electricity using a certain portfolio. They're looking at reliability, and they're looking at cost. And so it's not possible, and I think many would even argue that the North Carolina Utilities Commission does not have the statutory authority to dictate to a utility the type of electricity or the type of source that they will use to generate their electricity from. Another example from the environmental end. There are a lot of groups looking for North Carolina to impose more stringent air or water quality standards in North Carolina that would, in effect, prohibit or limit additional coal generation. But there are some limitations there because DENR, just like the Utilities Commission, is limited in terms of what they can actually do. Much of North Carolina's air quality regulations are actually tied into the federal regs. And the General Assembly, as part of regulatory reform in the last legislative session, passed Senate Bill 781. And one of the parameters in that limited the ability of North Carolina's environmental regulators to go beyond the federal standard. So if the federal standard says, for X emittant, you've got a level of 10. North Carolina the regulators in North Carolina have a pretty high bar to show why we should not abide by that 10 and instead should drop it down to a limit of 5. So there are parameters put on what the environmental regulators in North Carolina can do. So they can't simply decide, well, we want more renewable energy, so we're going to make it harder to build coal. There are parameters that have been laid out by the General Assembly that structures that discussion. One final example that comes to mind, this discussion comes and goes, but we hear a lot about electric vehicles. Electric vehicles, have no emissions if they're just running on electricity, and we can get rid of gas stations, and you really cut down greenhouse gases when it comes to transportation. However, electric cars have to get their power from somewhere. Well, where does that come from? It's got to come from a power plant. And there are some studies out there that say that if everybody immediately converted to using an electric car, then you would essentially double the amount of electric generating capacity that you need. Where is that generation going to come from? Well, we're back to the same old problem of what is the most cost-effective, reliable source of electricity, and right now that is coal generation. We see Duke and Progress building a number of gas peaking plants, but those kick on once electricity usage gets pretty high, especially during the summer months, and they kick on to ensure that the additional load that may be put on by air conditioners or something else in the peak hours of the day, maybe between noon and 6 o'clock, that there's enough electricity to cover that. So you're once again back to your baseload generation analysis of what do we use to generate our electricity? Yep, we can get gas cars off the road, but you still got to generate that energy at some point. So I give you all these examples simply to show you some of the practical issues that we face, not only here in North Carolina, but across the country when it comes to regulators looking at the issues of the future of energy. A number of people have the misconception that the regulators can just regulate and make it so. But those regulators are very confined to what the General Assembly has allowed them to do. So where does this leave us? Ultimately, I think, with respect to the debate between renewable energy and traditional fossil fuels, I think that the market will eventually answer that question for us. As the cost of renewable energy falls, it's going to approach the cost of the baseline, the the base load generation that we currently use in North Carolina and across the country. And once those costs become on par, then you can start picking and choosing a little more what type of energy you want to use to generate your electricity. If you remove the subsidies and you start factoring in the externalities, that gap closes even faster. So the question is, do we allow the market to do that, or is there some compelling reason why we want to step in as the General Assembly or whatever decision makers you have and try and foster that discussion? And as you heard the two speakers prior to me say, in some instances, North Carolina has already done that. In 2007, you had Senate Bill 3. And Senate Bill 3 was the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard. 12.5% of North Carolina's energy has to come from renewable resources by, I believe it's 2022, right in that time period. There are also specific carve-outs, and this goes to another motivation, I guess, specific carve-outs from where that energy has to come from. There is a specific carve-out that so much energy per year has to come from solar. There's a carve-out that so much has to come from poultry waste, and so much has to come from swine waste. Now, it's not that swine and poultry necessarily are great generators of electricity, but part of the idea at that time was, let's not just talk about environmental issues, let's look at economic and job issues as well. So you've got multiple factors that are driving your energy policy. On the one hand, you've got environmentalists who are concerned about the quality of the environment. Right or wrong, disagree with it or not, that is their chief concern. And they support renewable energy. But on this side, you may have a group of folks that are interested in fostering job creation in North Carolina. And in doing that, you've heard a lot of discussion about the creation of the green economy. That, I think, was also one of the drivers in passing Senate Bill 3. You've got other folks that are very concerned about American energy independence. It's a national security issue for them. So just because you hear the concepts of renewable energy, don't automatically assume that it's all about an environmental concern. You have economic concerns, you've got job concerns, you've got national security concerns. And when you put all of those people together under the big tent, then I think you've got the opportunity to have that very real discussion that we heard Mr. Inglis talk about earlier today. You've got a lot of people that come from a lot of different perspectives. They may not necessarily agree with each other's, but they're trying to get the same point. They may be trying to achieve different goals by getting there, but they're trying to get the same point. So I think market factors and as these various interests converge, I think that is going to facilitate more alternatives for energy in North Carolina's future. One final word on fracking. You know, fracking is not legal in North Carolina yet. The General Assembly passed a bill that has directed Diener and other entities to start laying out rules to study how to do it and how to do it right. The General Assembly recognized, I think correctly so, that there is a great resource underneath our ground that can be used. And if it's here, there's no reason not to use it. I did shudder when I heard Mr. Hood say that there are some people that think this can fund the state budget for years on end. I tell you, that's not true. So the reason that we take a measured approach is to make sure that we do it and we do it right. No one wants the groundwater or the aquifers contaminated. Yet I see no reason to leave a great energy resource in the ground that could otherwise be used here in North Carolina and also used to create jobs. So the General Assembly started that process, but in order for fracking to actually happen, the General Assembly actually has to act again. And you also have regulatory agencies that are going to have to enact rules that will lay out that framework. But this also has been an evolutionary process. As the price of natural gas has fallen, it has become more attractive to convert vehicles and convert other engine sources to run on natural gas. But there's a tension there because gas isn't going to be at this price forever. Gas is eventually going to go up. Now, as that price goes up, it becomes more economically viable to extract that here in North Carolina and use it. but it also becomes more expensive to continue with that natural gas conversion. There are a lot of factors that are in play here. And we have to decide, I think, as North Carolina policymakers, to what extent do we want to set back and do we want the market to drive this? And are we okay with the time frame? Or are there places where it's appropriate for the General Assembly, or to the extent they delegate that authority to regulators, to then help push that market a little further, a little faster? And I think that's the ultimate issue that we have to deal with today and going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We'll dive into the questions. And we have a couple questions, John, for you on, you're talking about the Clean Smokestacks Act and mentioning that the lack of benefits that came along with that act. And a few different people have noted a Nicholas Institute report in July of 2012 that came to a different conclusion. Would you like to comment on that report if you're aware of it?
The report that came out earlier this year, as far as I know, did not compare the changes in air quality in North Carolina compared to neighboring states over the course of a long period of time to see if there was a significant effect on air quality and on human health in North Carolina. That's the data that you need, and efforts to quantify the benefits that assume the things that happened after the passage of the bill were caused by the bill. It's not very persuasive to me, but I'm always open to new research.
Okay, thank you. For the whole panel, would anyone like to comment on the North Carolina Senate bill dealing with scientific recognition of sea level rise that was controversial and got some national press?
No, I don't want to comment. Well, for me, that was one of those silly debates that went on in the General Assembly. Was it Colbert that picked that up and had a good time at the North Carolina General Assembly's expense? It's for me like a number of the issues that have occurred this past year, where the bill early in the process, okay, it got introduced. It maybe doesn't reflect the best science or thought, but it's so what? It's part of the debate, and it never got close to passing in anything like the form that Mr. Colbert talked about it. I would add, my brother's in Vienna, Austria, and I caught all sorts of hell about this bill, and I was very glad to have it go away.
This is a good example of how careful bill drafting and explanation is important, because essentially the entire controversy was manufactured out of a misunderstanding of what the intention of the bill was. This is really not that complicated, but it was very poorly explained and remains confusing. But it's essentially this. If you have a model that you're attempting to use to project the future, and this model could be the economy, it could be sea level rise, it could be gambling patterns in Las Vegas, it doesn't make any difference. If you have a model that is attempting to predict the future and it cannot predict the past, then you ought not to bet any money on it. So if you have a model that predicts the future based on predicted rises in average temperatures, particularly the temperature of the ocean, and the effects of melting ice on the water levels on the Outer Banks, and you say that this is absolutely the best science that we have available based upon the climate models that predict the future, and those models and the sea level rise models do not predict recent experience in sea level rise, then you've got a problem. That's what the attempt was to argue that historical data should be used to evaluate whether the models successfully predict sea level rise. Because global warming didn't start yesterday, presumably it has been going on for some period of time, which means that you can evaluate whether the projected increase in global warming in the future will result in a certain level or range of sea level rises by seeing if the past is predicted by that or a similar model. That's what the attempt was, to argue that the recent experience with sea level rise does not comport with what the apocalyptic predictions would have suggested. Now, I agree entirely with Chuck that the bill it shouldn't have been, because their sea level rise has only risen a certain amount, we can only say it will rise a certain amount. That was foolish. But to challenge the idea that the models that were provided were an accurate measure is entirely legitimate. In fact, we're about to publish a study on this topic that significantly questions the scientific validity of the proposed model of sea level rise.
All right, thank you. Chuck, a question for you. To what extent does your conservationist background, to what extent did it play a role in your choice to seek public office? And how do your conservationist principles affect your day-to-day life as a legislator?
It probably was the reason I ran for public office. I originally ran for county commission. And that occurred when the county commissioners were telling me as planning committee chair that I needed to be about one thing, and at the same time I was doing it, they were doing just the opposite. And when I found out, I got really pissed off. And I went out there and shook my finger in the front of some guy's face, and I lost to him the first time by about 100 votes, and the second time I won quite easily. And my environmental work has been a part of my entire life. What wasn't mentioned in my resume was I did practice law in Atlanta for the better part of 2 decades, but then I quit all that, bought a summer camp for kids up in western North Carolina, and ran as a business for the last 2 decades. And I'm now in the General Assembly. I can't run a summer camp because of the schedule of the General Assembly.
You're still running a summer camp for kids.
Well, no, the same behaviors I saw out of the kids that I could put them on the front porch of their cabins in time out, I can no longer do that because these are called peers and leaders. But that's a whole different subject. The values that I got, and I guess it was from summer camp long time ago, I spent way too much time, obviously, out in the woods and on the lakes and the rivers of western North Carolina. And that set of values permeate pretty much everything I'm about. The difference, I guess, is I come to it as a business person with long-time conservative beliefs, and I think we as Republican legislators particularly have just given up on the issue of the environment. One, it's not a particularly salient political issue, but two, it's not an issue we want to talk about. And my goal in running for public office has really been to change that to some degree. I represent a very Republican district, and yet I can talk about clean air and clean water, and Republican voters will continue to vote for me, despite the fact that I'm talking about some different set of issues, and in perhaps a different way than some of my liberal, democratic environmental friends within the environmental community.
Thank you. And one last question. This one's for you, Chris. To what extent do partisan politics play a role in the workings of the Environmental Management Commission?
Good question. I was appointed to the EMC by Speaker Tillis in June of 2009, so I have been on the commission, in 2011. So I've been on the commission for less than 2 years. I can tell you that I don't see partisan politics per se. You don't see Republican, Democrat on the EMC. But you do see that everybody, it's just human nature, has a starting point for how they enter into a discussion or a debate. So, and I quite frankly have been surprised by some folks. The General Assembly up until 2010 had been, for the most part, controlled by the Democratic Party for the last 100 years. And of course, the governor's mansion has been the Democrats have been in charge there for the last 20. So, when I came on, I was one of the first Republican appointees into that body in quite a while. And I sort of naturally assumed that most folks on the EMC sort of looked at things from a certain point of view. But after a couple of meetings and a couple of deliberations on declaratory rulings or contested cases that came to us for final decisions, I was pleasantly surprised that a number of folks that were appointed by the Democratic governor actually are just as likely to see things from my point of view as not. And that just because you were appointed by one party does not mean that you necessarily see the world from that point of view. Now, that having been said, it's having been on there for a year and a half, you pretty much get a good idea from where folks are going to start the conversation. But I rarely see an instance where you start the conversation and you just have to end the conversation at the same point simply because of party politics. That, you've got your starting point, but then this body is generally pretty good about navigating through the facts and through the evidence, and oftentimes coming up with sometimes creative decisions that everyone doesn't necessarily get excited about, but everybody can agree is a reasonable approach to whatever issue that we're addressing.
All right, that's it for this panel. Thank you all so much. We really enjoyed it. Thanks, everybody.
And thanks again. We have one last panel for today on free market environmentalism. First, I want to thank everyone for staying around this long. And also, I heard a statement about Chuck McGrady a few weeks ago that and it wasn't about his environmental views, but just the fact that he was willing to have different views, where someone's like, well, it gives me faith in the state legislative system. And so thanks for being here, Chuck, and for doing what you do. And our last panel, and the first speaker on our last panel has me particularly excited. I never thought I would say this when I came to law school, that I'm a little bit of a legal groupie, but he's one of the top scholars in any field, and we're thrilled to have him here today. Professor Jonathan Adler serves as the director of Case Western Reserve University School of Law's Center for Business Law and Regulation. He is widely regarded as one of the nation's foremost scholars of environmental law and regulatory policy. He is a regular contributor to many popular legal blogs and the National Review Online. His work is widely published in forums ranging from the Harvard Law Review to the Wall Street Journal. And he's a frequent commenter on legal and environmental issues for national radio and television programs. Professor Adler is a graduate of George Mason School of Law and served as a clerk on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals before launching his academic career. We're thrilled to have you here, Professor Adler, and take it away.
Because like most law professors, I can speak as long as I'm allowed to, and want to make sure I leave time for Reed and for questions. But thank you for that introduction. It's definitely a pleasure to be here to talk about environmental policy and to talk about what a conservative vision for environmental policy might look like, and why trying to place free market principles at the centerpiece of, or at the center of environmental policy would be the sort of thing that we should do. Just to begin, I want to say, perhaps at the risk of echoing some of the comments that have been made before, I want to say a little bit about what I think the current dominant response on the right is to environmental policy. It's been noted that many on the right, when environmental policy, tend to shut up rather than propose solutions. I don't think that's always true, but I think this is a problem that has actually gone back for quite some time. About this point, close to 20 years ago, gave a talk just before Republicans took over Congress in 1995, and pointed out then something that I think is true today, but perhaps even more so, that there were only two responses to environmental problems that you tended to see on the right and generally and in the Republican Party in particular. One response would be to say that you're for whatever the other side's for, you're just going to make it cost a little bit less. This was the sort of approach that was commented by from a lot of Republicans in Congress who wanted to characterize themselves as moderates, and that's clearly unsatisfactory. If something like protecting the environment is important, if it's something we care about, if it's something that matters to us and to our children, it doesn't make a lot of sense necessarily to try and do it on the cheap.